chapter, the Gospel according to St. John. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Ecclesia, Reformata, sed Semper, Reformanda. It's a Latin phrase that literally translated means the church reformed, but ever reforming. That phrase is a perfect way to define and explain and describe what Reformation Sunday is all about. Have you ever noticed that the church has changed a lot from the way it used to be? It's been said that the most feared word in the Lutheran language is that word change. We can hardly say it, and yet somehow we Lutherans have managed to do a whole lot of changing over the years. I remember when every other word, it seemed like in our worship services or in the scripture readings, was the word thee or thy or thou or thine or something like that. I remember, as many of you do, when you were a ninth grader on Confirmation Sunday, you had to stand up in front of the congregation and be prepared to recite anything from Luther's small catechism that anybody would ask you to recite. On this Sunday I had to do that. I closed my eyes, I was going like this, I was afraid, and I heard a voice say, "Recite the third article of the Apostles' Creed and Luther's meaning," and I thought, "Oh no," and I looked up, it was my brother asking the question. I was 17 years old before women were allowed to be ordained as pastors. And I was well into my 30s before the youngest of children were allowed to come forward to receive communion on a regular basis. Oh yes, we've changed a lot over the years, and most of those changes have been good and necessary. And yes, some of the changes have been difficult, but guess what? Through all of them, we've adapted, we've changed, and God is still God. Like nearly everything else in life, as times have changed, the church has changed, and it will continue to change, and it needs to change in some ways if it's going to be relevant and make a difference in a society that, as you and I know, is becoming increasingly secular. But the question, of course, is always, how is the church going to change? Where shall it change? And maybe just as importantly, how do our lives need to change? The third chapter of the New Testament book of Romans gives us these words: "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but they are justified by his grace as a gift." That verse is the entire gospel in a nutshell, and it is the heart and soul of the Protestant Reformation. It tells us what is absolutely true. There is not a single one of us who is sin-free. Not a single one of us is perfect, no matter how much we like to think so, no matter how much we like to pretend. We are all flawed. We sin, and we sin again. But despite ourselves, we are loved more than we can even imagine, and we are completely forgiven by God. And I want you to hear that. I didn't say we are somewhat forgiven by God. We are sometimes forgiven by God. We are a little bit forgiven by God. I said we are completely forgiven by God. And I hope you get the magnitude of that. Doesn't matter your past. Doesn't matter how great or big your mistakes. God has forgiven and forgotten. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a message that's incredible, powerful, and life-changing, and I need to hear it every single day. As the church, we should never be a bunch of holier-than-thou people who look down our noses at people that we deem somehow to be less holy than ourselves. I remember as a young kid, a young pastor, fresh out of seminary, came to my house to visit. He was 26 years old. I mean, he was a kid. He was there to ask my dad, and my dad was a pretty stern man. He was there to ask my dad, why aren't you in church on Sunday? My mother and my younger brother and I all went to church every single Sunday, but my dad didn't. And so this young pastor, right out of seminary, came to the church to boldly ask my dad why he wasn't there. And my dad gave him the answer. I'm not there because, frankly, Pastor, the church is just full of a bunch of hypocrites. To which that 26-year-old pastor looked right at him and joyfully said, Floyd, there's always room for one more. We are a bunch of hypocrites, and deceivers, and fibbers, and egocentrics, and grudge holders, and the list could go on and on and on. Our sin takes many different shapes and forms in our homes and families and lives, and yet God says this about all of it: I forgive you. And my gift to you, God says, is the gift of a brand new start. What's in the past is in the past. That gift should be at the very center of who we are as people. Anyone who encounters you in life should see it clearly reflected in you. And it most definitely ought to be reflected in who we are as a church. If it isn't, then that's what needs to be reformed. 500 years ago, the church didn't want people to hear that good news. At least they didn't want them to hear it for free. What the church wanted was for people to believe that God's love was for sale. So if you gave a little bit to the church, then you could get a little bit of God's favor and love and forgiveness. If you gave a little more, then you got a little more of God's love and forgiveness. It was a great deal. At least it was for the churches. Priests could stand up on a Sunday morning and they could remind everyone how bad they were the previous week, especially the wealthy. And then they could inform them there's one way that you can fix the problem: pass the offering plates. And they did, and voila, just like that, magically sins were forgiven. And oh, by the way, churches raked in a fortune from all the guilty consciences. As I said, that worked well for the churches and the priests, but the problem was it wasn't biblical, and so reformers like Martin Luther refused to stand by and let God's grace be abused or for sale. What was biblical was this: for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but they are justified by God's grace as a gift. You didn't have to buy God's love, you could simply ask for it and receive it as the gift that God intended it to be. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church at Wittenberg as his way of telling the gospel truth. There is nothing that we can do in all creation to be loved more by God than we already are. There isn't any way we can work hard enough to earn God's grace. There is no strategy that we can employ to get God to be good to us. There is nothing we can pay to bribe God into forgiving our worst sin or healing our deepest hurt. We already have those things. We have God's love. We have God's forgiveness and peace. And best of all, it's free. To us, anyway. The Reformation's key purpose was to help people come to know God's goodness and grace as a gift so that it would change their lives. So I ask, is Reformation needed today? Whenever and wherever God's grace becomes something other than gift, whether in our church, in our homes, or in our lives, that's when we are in need of reform. There were two boys, ages 8 and 10, living in a small town with their parents. These boys always seemed to be in some kind of trouble. People in town just knew that if there was some mischief going on, somehow these two boys had to be in on it. One day the parents decided that they needed to do something to reform these boys. And so They had heard that the Lutheran pastor was particularly good at working with young kids. So they went to the pastor and they said, "Will you please meet with our boys and straighten them out?" The pastor agreed, but he said, "I will only do it on one condition, that is that I get to meet with each boy individually." And the parents said that was all right, and so on this particular day it was the 8-year-old's turn. The boy went into the pastor's office and he sat down. The pastor closed the door, and the little boy waited for the pastor to speak. After a couple of minutes of chit-chat, the pastor finally got down to business. He looked the boy in the eye and he said, "Tell me, young man, do you know where God is?" The little boy just stared at the floor. He didn't know what to say. So the pastor asked a little more sternly, "I said, do you know where God is?" The little boy was getting a little bit afraid because the pastor was raising his voice a little bit, so he now for sure didn't say anything. Finally, the pastor raised his voice even louder. This time he shook his finger at the boy. "Young man, I'm talking to you. I ask you, where is God?" Well, the young boy was so scared that he bolted from the pastor's office. He ran full speed out of the church. He ran all the way home, sprinted all the way home. He ran in the front door of the house. He went up the stairs. He went into his bedroom. He hid in the darkest corner of his closet. He slammed the door, and he shuddered, and the door was closed tight. After several minutes of hiding, the boy's 10-year-old brother came looking for him and found him in the closet. So the 10-year-old boy came in the closet and squatted down with the 8-year-old boy. And he looked at the boy and he said, "Oh my heavens, man alive, what's happened to you? You look terrified." The 8-year-old boy said, "Oh, we are in huge trouble this time. According to the pastor, God's missing and they think we did it." If people come to our church and sense that God is missing, it's time for reformation. If someone gets to know you personally and can see that God is missing, it's time for reformation. If you are struggling with something and trying to do it with God missing, it's time for reformation. If you take a close look at any part of your life and realize that God is missing, it is time for reformation. Before I retired, there was a couple in my church that I dearly loved. They were in their mid-70s, just loved life. They were fun people to be around, so faithful, there every Sunday, good church members. They were inspiring as a couple. They just made you want to be like them. They were so good to each other. One day I was working in the fellowship hall with the man on a project. We were building something. And right around noon, his wife comes to the church. She finds him and she says to him, "It's lunchtime. Thought I would come and stop by and invite you to go to lunch with me." Sounds like a great offer, he said, "but I think I'm going to stay here and work on this project with the pastor until it's done." She gave him the look. Have you ever gotten the look? "What?" she said, "You're turning down a date with your wife?" "Yep," he said playfully. He said, "I know you're irresistible, but I'd really like to finish this project." "Oh, I don't know what's happened," she said. "There was a time when I would invite you on a date, and we'd get in the truck and we'd sit right next to each other, and you'd put your arm around me and I'd put my hand on your knee. We were so close back then. I just miss those days. Whatever happened?" And he looked at her with a big smile and he said, "I'm not the one who moved." She walked up to him, grabbed him by his flannel shirt and said, "Come on, let's go." And he said, "Yes, dear." And they went and out the door to lunch. Wonderful. If it seems that God is missing, it's not because God moved. Time for a change. Ecclesia, Reformata, Semper, Reformanda. The church reformed, but ever reforming. Our lives reformed, but ever reforming. The good news is God will never give up on us. God rejoices in the many ways that we are faithful in responding to God's amazing gift of grace. But heaven knows there is more we can do. to make sure that God is not missing from our church and from our lives. On this Reformation Sunday, we celebrate the Reformers and the changes that they inspired over the years that have helped us to draw closer to God and recognize how great God's love for us truly is. At the same time, we ask God to help us see where changes still need to happen here and in our lives. Maya Angelou once said, "If you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, then change your attitude." With God's help, may we learn to change in attitude or otherwise, so that God seems even more present in our lives, in this church, and in this community, and may we never, ever stop being in complete awe of God's amazing gift of grace to you and me. Amen. Let's sing together hymn number 800.